I sent in my letter. At first, it felt exhilarating. When I finally got the letter back saying I was no longer a member of the church, it didn't feel exhilarating. It felt painful.
Mm,
It felt like I had removed myself from the only community that was worth calling a community that I had ever been in. And I thought, well, sort of like too bad because it's done now and not like they're going to let me back in. The new discoveries that I was making seemed to reinforce the model itself. And so I felt really certain of myself. I felt really certain Joseph Smith was not sincere. And I kind of like had the goods on Joseph Smith. And
Mormonism with the Murph, where Laodicean explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hi everyone, I just want to say that I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Don Bradley. This was a really long one, so there is going to be two parts because it was going to be like 4 hours, which would be like a Mormon Stories episode, which I was tempted to keep it as one part, but I think it's better as two parts. But it's a really powerful story. I know he shared it on different platforms, but I think we got into a lot of depth into his story as well, and I find it personally really touching, really inspiring as well. So please make sure you watch both parts, and I would encourage you to share it as well. Views have been a bit lower recently. I think probably the algorithms aren't doing as well, particularly since my break. And if you enjoy my content, I would appreciate liking, commenting, sharing as well on any social media platforms, anything like that to help sort of boost the channel. And donations have dropped off. And if you are someone who appreciates the work and the time that I put into it, if you think my content is valuable and would like me to keep going and upgrade and keep doing more topics and interviews and do more research, any donations would be appreciated, whether or not recurring on Patreon or if you want to do one off on PayPal. That would really mean a lot to me. But thanks everyone who does support for all the kindness and encouragement that you give me. I'm hoping to keep going for the next while. So part one very much focuses on Don's faith journey and his faith crisis. And we kind of get up to the point where he leaves the church and removes his name. And part two is going to focus a lot more on his path back to the church and restoring his faith again. So make sure you watch both parts. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Laodicean explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I am really, really excited for today's episode. I'm going to be doing an interview with researcher and historian Don Bradley. Don, thanks for joining me today.
hey there, Stephen. Good to be on.
Yeah, I have been wanting to interview you really since the beginning of my channel. I resonate so much with your story, and similar with my story, stepping away from the church for a while, going through a crisis of faith. And I think you have a really unique and a powerful story. You left the church, you were an atheist, ex-Mormon, and then you had experiences that restored your faith, both in God and Christianity, but also in the restoration that brought you back. And you've also done some incredible research into Joseph Smith and many topics to do with the restoration. So I think this is going to be fascinating, today's episode. I'll just read a little bit of your bio, and then we can
Sure.
dive into your story. So I have here Don Bradley is an author and independent historian specializing in the beginnings of the Latter-day-Saint restoration. He completed a bachelor's history at BYU and a master's in history at Utah State University, where he wrote his thesis on American proto-Zionism and the Book of Lehi, recontextualizing the rise of Mormonism. That's a mouthful. Don has also performed an internship with the Joseph Smith Papers Project, working with the earliest Joseph Smith sources, and you're also the primary researcher for Brian C. Hale's 3-volume series on Joseph Smith's polygamy. You publish on the translation of the Book of Mormon, Plural Marriage Pour Nauvoo, Joseph Smith's Grand Fundamental Principles of Mormonism, the Kinderhook Plates, and early Latter-day-Saint understandings of the New Jerusalem. And you've also written a book called The Lost 116 Pages. Have I missed anything, or is that about accurate, that bio?
I mean, that's most of the things. Sure.
Okay. And I have to say that I have wanted to interview Don since the inception of my channel, and it's taken a while for this to come together. And, you know, in church history, we can sometimes be a little bit disturbed about the angel and the drawn sword story, you know, an angel coming to Joseph Smith. But I have to say, Don, if Joseph was as reluctant a polygamist and put it off, as reluctant as you have been to be interviewed and putting this off, that no wonder God sent an angel with a drawn sword. And it finally got to the point where I had to message Don's wife and be like, listen, he has put it off and put it off, and I'm going to send an angel with a drawn sword to slay him unless he does this interview. He is 24 hours, or else the gate is closed forever.
She
And
is, she
Don,
is my
being an
angel with
expert
cross.
researcher into polygamy, I think you appreciated those comments. And now you're here. But jokes aside, I think this is going to be really epic. I'm excited for it. And Don is going to come back for a part two, maybe even a third part. We'll see, where we will explore different church history topics like the Lost 116 Pages and Joe Smith's First Vision and polygamy. And then I'd also want to pick his brain on his views on different things like, I don't know, Book of Mormon translation or Book of Mormon geography or the Kinderhook plates or other topics, just to see Don's views. But this part, we're going to be focusing on Don's faith journey, his story. So I think this will be really fun. So Don, where should we begin? Where did you grow up? Were you born in the church? Maybe just tell us a little about your upbringing and anything you want to say about your family life.
Sure. So I think that it's a lot of people that I know who are historians of the Restoration. They like their family has deep roots in the church, maybe like pioneer heritage or something like that. Not mine. I'm second generation. My parents were converts. My mom was tracked out by missionaries in Baltimore, Maryland, several years before I was born. And that's where I was born. We lived in Maryland and Virginia for my first several years. Then we moved out to South Bend, Indiana, where Notre Dame is, and then we moved out to Utah in my early teen years. And so I got the experience for sure of like the mission field, so called, right? What the church was like
In the real
there.
world, outside the bubble.
And then I got the experience of, the church here in Utah and the difference. And frankly, it was a shock when I was 13 and we moved to Provo. And like sort of like everybody was LDS. And so the back in Indiana, it seemed like if there were kids who were trying to get you to do things that you weren't supposed to do, they were the non-Latter-day Saint kids. But here in Utah, the behaving kids and the misbehaving kids were both Latter-day
All Latter-day
Saint.
Saints.
Yeah.
That's different.
And moving to Utah helped lead to my research in the history of the church. The resources just would not have been available back east or in the Midwest to start doing that. And I did start as a teenager. I started becoming really serious about my faith when I was 15. It was partly a result of seminary. I mean, I was sort of a seminary success story as a teenager, I think, like my first year of seminary, it made me start really setting goals. So our teacher talked about setting goals. I started setting fitness goals and I started setting, goals of how I wanted to grow in different ways, including spiritually. And that really led me deeper into the scriptures. And I encountered the first inklings of real scripture scholarship when I was 16. And that was a mind blower for me. I was introduced to, it wasn't under this term, but basically I was introduced to exegesis, right? So I was introduced to this idea that there were systematic ways of getting at the original intended meaning of the text. So for instance, in say the Book of Mormon, you could look at, or in Joseph Smith's Revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants, you could look at how a particular phrase was used, right? And if you wanted to know what that phrase meant in a particular passage, maybe look at how it's used in other passages around it, and that will give you a fuller picture of what it's intended to mean. Or you can look at the structure of the passage itself, sort of the logic, how it builds on itself. I became really interested in all those clunky fors and wherefores in the Book of Mormon because I realized they weren't just filler words, they were logical connectors between different ideas. And so if I wanted to understand what it was saying, I needed to sort of chain through the logic of the statement. And so before that, for me, I think scripture, uh, as I saw it interpreted in church lessons, was kind of like a Rorschach inkblot test, right? Like, uh, people I came to realize would often sort of free associate on a particular word in a passage, and they'd say, well, what that makes me think of is this, and they might have nothing to do with what the passage is trying to say. So I realized that in a way there was a kind of science, if you will, of reading out the intended meanings of scripture. And then, of course, that there's also like personal application, right? And reading deeply with spiritual purpose, right? But these things sort of came together for me that you could combine um, the intellectual and the spiritual, that you could do intellectual work that would be part of your spiritual life.
And this was even before you were really diving into historical research. You already had this interest as what you said, a 14, 15-year-old studying the scriptures deeply, looking at them in detail, and wanting to understand what was the intention of the author. What did it actually mean
So,
by the author who wrote it? Very
yeah,
fascinating.
and I actually wasn't that interested yet in the history of the church. So my dad, when I was 16, for my 16th birthday, my dad gave me the book, The Personal Writings of Joseph Smith by Dean Jesse. And I remember he just thought I was going to be so excited because I was really like spiritually minded and I read a lot. And I remember thinking his personal writings, like, why would I be interested in that? I had like letters to Emma and things like that. I was like, I don't know.
That
I
sounds
don't know if I'd
boring.
be that interested in that. And of course, later that became an invaluable resource. I think it was within a year after that that I really did get into the history of the church. And partly at first, it was sort of studying controversial doctrinal ideas within the history of the Restoration, like the Adam God idea and things like that.
So you encountered some of that as a teenager.
I encountered it as a teenager. So there were friends of mine who were into that. They were in the church, but they were into like these sorts of ideas. And so then I became aware that there was scholarship on these. So I discovered an old article in Dialogue about the history of that idea. And that, excuse me, really became my first Mormon history project when I was 17, was I started going up to the church archives to look up all the references, to look up the sources. And I compiled my own, I had like one of those cardboard, like banker's file boxes, like with a stack of files where I had all the different early Adam God sources.
Wow.
And I was arranging them chronologically to see like the development of the idea across time. I wanted to know, I became curious, where did this idea come from and where did it go? Why did it disappear? And at first, my interest was really doctrinal, right? I wanted to understand, did this come from Joseph Smith? Because if it came from Joseph Smith, then for sure I was going to accept it. Right? And then I wanted to understand where did it go? Right? Like, did it? And what I found is that as good as the work was that had been done on the history of this idea and its demise, I could read the same sources that this historian David John Berger was reading, and I could identify a different stage in the sort of demotion of the idea, its disappearance. And it seemed evident to me. It was there in the sources, but he wasn't seeing it. And I think things like that started to give me some confidence, even as a teenager, that, hey, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could make discoveries of my own. I was reading really good historians, and I think in part I was sort of absorbing their methodology. And then I'd been a science kid, not a history kid. And I think I was bringing some of the the kind of systematic thinking that I learned from scientific, trying to figure things out scientifically to history. And so it was like detective work, working with these sources, trying to figure out unknown events of the past.
Almost like you had this gift or this knack or this keen eye to finding like new or interesting things in sources which some people maybe haven't noticed for, even certain scholars or historians, and that's probably an early seed for the later work that you would do with all the research and looking into historical sources.
It was definitely an early seed, and I don't know fully how people learn different skills, but I see almost everything as a learned skill. And so I think maybe working with science, I'd already learned certain skills that I just transferred over into history and then developed further from there. Yeah.
Okay. So before we get into when you first explored some controversial history, which I've
Yeah.
listened to recently in another
Yeah.
podcast, how
Sure.
would you describe would you say your family was very devout, very faithful, very
Oh, yeah.
orthodox? And did you feel like you had a spiritual testimony in terms of, did you just believe the church is what it claims to be, or did you feel like you had any spiritual experiences as well? Maybe describe your family life and your testimony before you
Sure.
dove into controversial things.
Sure. So I came from a very devout Latter-day Saint family and fairly strict parents. Our parents had us wear Sunday clothes all day on Sunday.
Oh, wow.
Uh, we didn't drink caffeinated drinks. Um, we really the range of activities we had on Sundays was pretty limited. Like we didn't watch television. Usually we didn't play with friends. It was like a family day. Um, my family often had scripture study. They were definitely religious about having family home evening. My adoptive dad, so my mom had remarried, right? And my adoptive dad was he was sort of, he had more of an authority emphasis, kind of, and a more doctrinal emphasis and very orthodox. Um, my mom's um, faith, my dad had come from a Catholic background before he was Latter-day Saint. My mom had come from a Baptist background, and she felt like she already really, they were both devout when they were young people, right, in their respective faiths. She felt like she had a real relationship with Father in heaven and Jesus before she became a Latter-day Saint and just brought that in with her, you know. And her emphasis was definitely kind of softer than my dad's. And I identified greatly with her. So I think, but my dad he really got me thinking about how, as a teenager, about how we put God first, right? Like God is really our priority. And I think that had a giant impact on my spiritual development. I did have spiritual experiences. I always felt from the time that I was a young child that I genuinely knew that the church was true, that it was just something that I sensed. Now exactly what that would have meant to me as a young child, might be a different question, but it was definitely something. I remember getting up and bearing my testimony and just feeling, that I knew that this was the case. As a teenager, I had some very strong spiritual experiences when I became really devout, like at 15, 16. Um, I sort of delved into, in a way, like spiritual practices that were, as Latter-day Saints, we don't necessarily talk a lot about spiritual practices often, but many of them are there in the scriptures, to be found and in our personal scripture study. Um, there are, in the Book of Mormon, there are ideas like in Alma 5, like visualization of scriptural spiritual events. Like Alma asks, can you see yourself at the last day standing before God, and so on. Um, Alma 37, 36, and 37 were big for me. They really emphasize a kind of practice of constant prayer, trying to stay aware of God's presence always. So I had deep spiritual experiences as a teenager.
And you also seemed very deeply spiritual, and you really had this love and desire to really feast upon the scriptures and like pondering and like visualizing the things it was teaching and the doctrine. Like it sounds like you were really taking the gospel very seriously
I
when you were a
took it
teenager.
incredibly seriously, became the center of my life. So I always thought a lot as a kid about meaning. I mean, surprisingly early, let's say. I remember being 11 years old and thinking about the fact that someday I would die and wondering like what my legacy would be, wondering what the meaning of my life would be, thinking about my future children. And then when I was 15, I started thinking about, well, what's the meaning of meaning? Kind of like, why are the things that are meaningful to us meaningful? Is there some ultimate purpose? And in the in the restoration, we talk about becoming like God as the ultimate purpose of life. And there might be different ways we might conceptualize that idea, but if we see God as being ultimate, then kind of what could possibly be the ultimate purpose of our lives other than that? And so that became really what I was focused on. Um, and so when I was reading the scriptures, I was actually reading them looking for commandments and principles that I didn't already know, that I didn't wasn't already living. I wanted more.
Okay, so it sounds like at this time you probably felt pretty sure and strong in your
Oh,
testimony.
yeah,
So
I didn't have any
I've
doubt.
I've listened to you in a previous interview, and I think this is quite funny that you say that your faith crisis kind of began with a family home evening. I'd like you to tell that story of you encountering some controversial issues, but you weren't seeking out anything anti-Mormon, anything critical.
Yeah,
But talk a bit about that and what impact it had upon you at this time.
sure. So like I said, my dad was in particular was very religious about us having family home evening. And for family home evening, we'd always have a lesson and we'd always have an activity. And our family home evening activity that day was to go to Deseret Book, that was then in the University Mall in Orem, Utah. And while we were there, he told us each that we could choose any church related book and he would buy it for us. And I was looking in the general authority section. And so, there between Boyd K. Packer and Joseph Fielding Smith, is, a few books by B.H. Roberts. I already had one book by him, which was his Mormon Doctrine of Deity. I knew he had edited the history of the documentary history of the church that my dad had. I knew he'd been a general authority. He was a big deal, right? He had died in like the 30s, long before, right? And so there was actually, even though he had died several decades earlier, there was a new book by him, surprisingly at Deseret Book. It was called Studies of the Book of Mormon. And I did not at the time realize the history of the book, right? So I didn't realize that in the early 1900s. So I was 17 at the time. In the early 1900s, B.H. Roberts had encountered questions about the historicity of the Book of Mormon that were challenging. And they were particularly challenging under the view that was held at the time and was still held primarily while I was growing up, the so-called hemispheric model of Book of Mormon geography, that the narrow neck of land was in Panama, and the land southward was the entire continent of South America, the land northward was the entire continent of North America, and that the origin of all Native Americans was the Book of Mormon peoples, right?
Right,
So
the seed of
the
Lehi.
Lehites and the Mulekites, right? And so on that idea, there are certain things Roberts came to see that one would expect. So, for instance, linguists already at that time had come to understand how languages diversify and how long it takes roughly for one language to evolve into a very different language, right? And so if the peoples of the America had just started 2,500 years earlier, then the tremendous range of languages in the Americas, from the Inuit or Eskimos, right, up in Alaska down to, the people in Tierra del Fuego and up to, the northeastern United States and so on, would just be really difficult to understand. The genetic diversity of those peoples and so on. And so Roberts decided that what he needed to do was he saw that the church's critics had not yet hit on these arguments against Book of Mormon historicity. So he thought he would kind of head them off at the pass, right?
Prepare them a bit.
Right. If he thought if we can start to grapple with these questions before our critics do, then maybe we can come up with answers to those questions before our critics even fully raise those questions. And so he privately prepared a large manuscript of what he called like Book of Mormon problems. Right?
Was this the same book as well, where he had all of the parallels between the Book of Mormon and themes or elements in the view of the Hebrews? Was that in this volume as well?
I think that's a separate manuscript, but it was published in the same volume.
Okay.
Called Studies of the Book of Mormon. Yeah. So I saw this book at Deseret Book, and what I did not realize was, first of all, the background, that this was B.H. Roberts' devil's advocate case against the historicity of the Book of Mormon. So he's trying to make a case that it wasn't historical and Joseph Smith could have written it, even though that was not his own position. That was what he was. Okay. And so the manuscript, he never intended to have it published. But several decades after his death, apparently some of his descendants consented to have someone publish it. And I read it not really understanding fully the context. I just saw, wow, this book looks fascinating. B.H. Roberts is like, he's analyzing Joseph Smith's dreams in certain places, and he's like talking about Joseph Smith's psychology and just things that just fascinated me as a 17-year-old. So
and the title just sounds like a deep study of the Book of Mormon. And at this time, you were sort of exploring history, but you were really interested in scripture as well. So I can understand from looking at it, and you thought, hey, B.H. Roberts, he's a general authority. This is a safe book. This isn't going to challenge my testimony at all.
Right. So if this had been from Gerald and Sandra Tanner or, other known critics of the church, I would have had my guard up more. I would have maybe had more of a filter and been like, oh, I'm not so sure about this thing this person's saying. But this was B.H. Roberts. Right? This is
and were you aware, had you encountered any of that sort of more critical or anti-Mormon material before then? You
had at the local public library, yeah.
Okay.
I always felt kind of icky looking at it, but sometimes I did look at it. But like I said, I had my guard up when I was reading that stuff, right? This came in under the radar, right? So I took it home, I started reading, and it seemed like it raised really strong questions. And like I said, it was John Sorensen published his work on really starting to promote a limited geography model. He'd already published that by this time, but it wasn't like popularized. So
yeah, his book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, I think it was 1985. It was around that time when it was published.
Yes. So that would have already been out, but it's not like that idea was really popularized. It's been relatively more recently that Latter-day Saints have seen the Book of Mormon as having a more limited, and Latter-day Saints in general have seen it as having more limited geographical scope.
And I think that's even more in scholarly circles or people who are engaging with apologetics. I think even if you asked most of the average members who don't think too deeply, they would still probably think hemispheric geography. That's what I grew up believing and assuming as well.
Yeah. So these arguments that he's laying out mostly assume a hemispheric geography model, and they basically disprove a hemispheric geography model. Well, the hemispheric geography model was the model that I was familiar with. It's what the people in my family, the people around me understood. And so I thought, wow, like maybe raise this question, maybe the Book of Mormon isn't historical and maybe the Book of Mormon isn't true, and that threw everything open for me, like if the Book of Mormon, up until a certain point, when I was a kid, it was those blue covers with like the golden Moroni on the front. And it
Yeah,
actually had photographs in it showing like archaeological sites and archaeological relics, showing things that align with things that are in the Book of Mormon. And so I was raised with the impression that the Book of Mormon was like there was even a popular book, The Trial of the Stick of Joseph, that basically had like this mock courtroom sort of setting. And basically the idea was the Book of Mormon is so true you could prove it in court, right? And so I was raised with this idea that the Book of Mormon's truth was certain even on like an archaeological level. And so to have that so strongly, the understanding of it that I had, this hemispheric model, so effectively challenged by Roberts's book, it threw me into this crisis. Well, is the Book of Mormon true? If the Book of Mormon might not be true, then, was Jesus resurrected? Like, do we live after death? Is there a God? It just when something that was so certain to me was called into question, it just called into question a lot of other certainties as well. And I'd had spiritual experiences, so the question wasn't had I had spiritual experiences. I knew that I had. I think my question then became, were those just like internal personal experiences from my own being, my own mind, or were they from outside of myself? That became the question. I wasn't denying the experiences, but I was wondering where they came from.
right. Because you're probably thinking, I had these experiences, but how could I have had a spiritual experience and testimony from God, supporting it being true, and then encountering these arguments challenging Book of Mormon historicity? Because if the Book of Mormon could be disproven, then your spiritual experiences couldn't be what you interpreted they were.
Yeah, it raised a lot of questions for me. And I actually became uh the summer between my junior and senior year of high school, just after I had read Roberts's book, I became almost agnostic. Like I was sort of intellectually agnostic, but through kind of an act of will, I still believed. I still believed, but I worried.
Right. Did you feel like you had really strong intellectual doubts and concerns, but maybe spiritually you still believed and hoped for? And
Yeah.
what sort of impact did that have on, for example, like your devotional scripture reading, your prayer, your church
Oh, it's
attendance? And then did this cause you to explore more issues after this around this time?
yeah, yeah, of course. So part of the effect that it had was it became a giant distraction in terms of, so after this, I would try reading the scriptures. I'd be reading in the Book of Mormon, and because of things I'd read in Roberts's book, I started noticing a lot of New Testament language or New Testament allusions that bugged me because I was like, what's the New Testament doing in there?
Why is
Like,
Paul being quoted?
right. And so my ability to just focus at that time on like the spiritual depths of the text, which I had been doing, right, got like sidetracked, and like reading the scriptures sometimes would stoke my doubts rather than calm my doubts. And so it was difficult. It was very difficult. And it did lead me to I looked at like a view of the Hebrews, right, which is claimed Joseph Smith used in writing the Book of Mormon, right? That's a common secular explanation. I looked at the Spalding manuscript. I looked at different things. None of them seemed to me too impressive, particularly the Spalding manuscript. I mean, that's like you have to be the literary equivalent of tone deaf to think the same author wrote these things.
Well,
Um,
whenever I see critics like Dan Vogel and the Tanner saying, yeah, this isn't a source for the Book of Mormon, Joe Smith didn't use it, that's when you're like, okay, there's definitely nothing to this. If even prominent critics are saying, no, not strong similarities.
yeah, right, exactly, yeah. And so, but part of what happened in the midst of all this is that some of these questions took on a life of their own for me, right? So I started out wanting to understand doctrine, wanting to understand spiritual principles that I could apply, and then added to that wanting to understand faith questions. But then I added to those things just a straight up fascination with the history itself. So kind of how did the restoration come together, and what did Joseph Smith do? And I partly that was motivated just by curiosity, and partly there was a spiritual motivation because um, Joseph Smith. So something about me, I guess. I learned in a psychology class once that the idea that your earliest memories tell something about you. So I identified my earliest dozen memories, which are all up to the time I was 3.5. And all but one of them were about curiosity. They were about exploring the world around me, you know? And so I'm just super curious. I just want to know stuff, right? And so I just want to know what happened. And I also had this motive of I looked at the scriptures and I thought, what proportion of the scriptures come to us through various prophets, right? So you think about in the Bible, um, the first four books are attributed to Moses, right? That's a good chunk. I mean, Isaiah is a very long book, and so on, right? Um, Joseph Smith, yeah, the Book of Mormon, almost the entire Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price. That's a lot of revelation. And I thought I wanted to understand more about receiving personal revelation. And so I thought, well, who better to study than Joseph Smith? This guy knew how to do it. This guy knew how to receive revelation. He knew the principles and practices, the methods for receiving revelation. If I figure out what he was doing, then I can emulate that. And so I actually had like this odd mix of I was trying to study things in the Restoration for their deep spiritual value to me. I was trying to study them to figure out some of these questions that Roberts and others had raised now, challenging my faith. And I just became curious, like, wow, there are these stories, like there are things that happen that we don't fully understand, and I want to understand them.
Right.
I want to figure it out.
So there's a lot going on at this time. Is that you're encountering challenges against Book of Mormon historicity. Maybe you're starting to encounter other things in church history. So you have some issues, but you're also still seeking and spiritually seeking after revelation and wanting to learn more about Joseph Smith. So
Yeah.
I know you didn't leave the church at this time when you're around 17, 18. So how did you sort of navigate and sort of did you feel like you got through this period, or did you feel like you sort of
I did.
set some things on the shelf and then they came back a few years later and you had to deal with them? Like, talk about over the next few years what the process was in your faith journey.
So I was able to take these issues really and resolve some of them to sort of well enough for myself at the time, right? So I started thinking a lot about the translation of the Book of Mormon, reading about it, reading what it says about it in the Book of Mormon itself, thinking about the implications of some of what I was seeing in the text. And I started to think that in the translation, and this is not going to be a strange idea to people, right? But it was new to me at the time, right? I started to think that Joseph Smith was very actively involved. His mind was very involved in the translation process. And that if you felt so Brigham Young said something once. He said, if the Book of Mormon were to be retranslated today, would it be the same? And he said, no, it would be noticeably different in many places, and so on. And I started thinking, well, Revelation, let's take the book of Isaiah. Okay. So Isaiah speaks in the voice of the Lord, thus saith the Lord. right? But we also talk about Isaiah's poetry, Isaiah's literary qualities, and we can contrast those with those of Jeremiah. Well,
Right.
Jeremiah is also
Different
speaking the
prophets.
voice of the Lord. So why is the voice of the Lord different between Jeremiah and Isaiah or any other prophet you can identify? If it were just straight up that the Lord is dictating things independent of the prophet's own faculties, wouldn't you think it might be pretty much kind of the same voice, like maybe pitched differently in terms of content, but the voice, the style would seem probably would be largely the same. So we seem to accept when it comes to the biblical prophets that the revelation is kind of filtered through their own minds. Why would we think differently when we're talking about modern day prophets, right? Um, and so I started thinking that, Joseph Smith was his mind was very involved in these processes, and that might explain some of the odd things that I was seeing in the Book of Mormon, like the use of King James New Testament phraseology and things like that. And my views were tentative at the time, but I was coming up with, I was trying to come up with my own explanations. You could say I was coming up with my own apologetics, but over time, what I was really trying to do was not to come up with apologetics per se. I was trying to come up with models that made sense of the data that I was seeing, because
Right.
I was aware of things that had been put forward as evidence for the Book of Mormon, for instance, and I was aware of evidence that had been put forward as evidence against the Book of Mormon, and kind of like, well, how do I account for the total set of evidence? This is what I was trying to do. And so I was
Right.
able to kind of set that aside. And not that it wasn't still an active thing in my mind, but it wasn't like eating at me the way that it had been at sort of the height of this faith crisis. And I was able to focus more again on kind of like building my spiritual life. Um, I felt, really good about going on a mission. I went to college. I went to what's now BYU, Idaho, right, before and just after my mission, and felt mostly there were times when the faith crisis would kind of come back, but I mostly felt good about things, but I kept learning.
Right. So it seems like what you're saying, you're sort of shifting your view of the Book of Mormon, maybe the nature of the translation of Joe Smith being, involved, playing a role as the translator. We often talk about in apologetic circles, type versus loose, but maybe being more of a functional translation, that it's maybe his language, his vernacular, his vocabulary, that he's very much involved in it as a way to harmonize what you saw as maybe modern elements or like New Testament phrases or revivalist sort of language, but then still with ancient elements. And you were sort of, do you think it was yourself trying to make sense of the data and you were coming up with a lot of these ideas, or were you listening to a lot of farms and apologetics as well? Was that part of your process as well?
Sure. I read, particularly right after my mission, not so much before my mission, but particularly after my mission, I delved a lot into, I would delve into the criticisms and the apologetics. I wasn't looking just at one side or the other. I would actually go up to
That's
the
good.
church history department, and I would have a sort of an issue for the day, right? Like today, I want to tackle, New Testament phraseology in the Book of Mormon, and so first I would read some of the more critical things at at the library part of the church history department. And then I would read some of the more apologetic things and I would think about it and I would look for additional materials and contemplate and see if I could come up with sort of a working hypothesis or working model. Um,
Your
something I
day
was
sounds so much about like what I do on my channel. That's amazing. I love that. I resonate so much with that. That's brilliant.
cool. Um, I really, this theme will come up later in our conversation, but I think something that I was trying to do, and I wouldn't have put it this way at the time, but I think I was on some level trying to take an empirical approach. So rather than come with an idea that Joseph Smith must have done something this particular way, in way X, I wanted to look at the data and say, okay, how did he do it? Right. Um, and so I wanted to see, um, so the Book of Mormon text is its own best evidence for how it was produced, right?
Hmm.
So the best evidence for Joseph Smith's translation process is going to be in the text itself. Now we have various accounts of the translation, but none of those are going to be as provide the depth of evidence that the text itself would provide. And so that's one of the things I was starting to look at was what do we see in the text itself, and what is it, how did the text come out, and what does that tell us about the process that Joseph Smith is using in translating?
Okay. So this is around what would you say your early to mid 20s? You're sort of going through this process where you're doing a lot of research, you're wanting to explore a lot of the main criticisms on a topic and the apologetics. You're doing it in quite a thorough, almost sort of systematic way. And at this point, would you feel like you were very much aware of most of the most common
Yeah,
criticisms,
yeah,
things to do with polygamy and the different
sure.
first vision accounts or Book of
Yeah,
Abraham or
very,
prophetic fallibility, uh,
oh,
masonry and the temple endowment. So when did it start to shift? Like, because it sounds to you like when I
sure.
compare and contrast my loss of faith, mine was very sudden. Mine was
Oh,
very orthodox, very conservative fundamentalist views of prophet, scripture, church history. And then whenever I was, 21 years old, within a couple of months of being exposed to like Grant Palmer and Dan Vogel and the Tanners and learning all these issues that you would see on Mormon Thinker, the CS Ladder, I was like, okay, I've lost my faith. I don't believe anymore. It seems like with
wow.
yours that you're learning things and you're encountering issues and then you're finding some ways to like reconcile it. And it seems like a slow burn over the years journey. So when did it start to shift towards you feeling like you're losing faith or you're having more doubts and it's maybe outweighing your belief scale?
Yeah, so in my like mid 20s, I actually felt tremendously confident in my faith. I'd been doing a lot of church history research, particularly on Joseph Smith and like the early visions and revelations of the restoration. I felt like I had a good grasp of things. I was making discoveries that had spiritual importance for me, but I also was sort of gradually shifting from understandings I'd been given from others to more idiosyncratic individual understandings. And my own ways of constructing things were different from those that I saw from other people, including other people who were doing like apologetics to wrestle these issues. Um, it was more like in the second half of my 20s that um, it started gradually. I didn't recognize at first that I was kind of transitioning out of my faith. Um, it wasn't until maybe I was about 28 that I started thinking, if I look at the trend line, I'm believing less and less of what I started out believing. I may be like in a process of losing faith. Like it struck me as something as a really startling idea. I had been trying to learn. Uh, I'd been reading in cognitive psychology about predictable flaws in human thinking, and I was trying to guard against those in myself. So sort of like critical thinking on steroids, kind of. And I was realizing ways that maybe I had been inadvertently weighing the evidence more in favor of what I believed or wanted to believe. And that kind of eroded some of the basis of my faith, and I came to question, or my belief, basis of my belief, and I came to question, and these things were okay. A lot of Latter-day Saints might have intellectual questions, but they fall back on faith itself, or they fall back on personal spiritual experiences. So what happened for me during that time was I thought, well, people of all different religions have faith in their religion. People tend to just have faith in whatever religion they were raised in. Like, why should I have faith, right? Like when if I'd been raised Catholic, would I just have faith in that and stick with that? Or what's the
Mm,
basis for having faith? And so I was coming to question the notion of faith, at least that I had been given, which was sort of like, well, your evidence takes you this far, and then you make sort of an additional leap up to here, which I actually don't think, and this might be a discussion for another time, but like if you look at Alma 32, I'm not really sure that's what it's saying, right? It seems to have a very rich, complex view of faith, that's different from the one that I had at the time that I was calling into question, right? So I didn't feel good about just falling back on faith at the time. And I started looking also similarly, I was getting comparative perspective from other religions. And I thought, well, there are these little Catholic girls who have visions of Mary, and Mary tells them very Catholic things, very distinctively Catholic things that are not things that Latter-day Saints believe. I realized I didn't believe in the content of those visions. And yet I didn't doubt that the little girls had the visions. And so I thought, well, then people can have really powerful religious experiences that I don't accept as somehow veridical. And so how do I know that my own experiences are veridical? So I looked back to the question I had at 17 of, well, are my experiences from here? Are they from
right.
me? Rather than from outside of me telling me what the truth is. And so I started leaning more and more on intellectual evidence that I was finding. And eventually, I had identified like a few historical sources as kind of like pillars of my faith, remaining pillars of my faith. Right? And then, and this would be its own whole story, and these are fascinating, but two of them I actually was able to identify. They're not well-known documents, as historical forgeries. Not like Mark
Mm.
Hoffman. They were more like descendants of early members of the church trying to maybe sort of like reconstruct lost family documents or something like that. But they had seemed initially to be legitimate documents when I examined them. And then I realized I sort of did sleuthing and realized they weren't. And I
And
thought,
were these quite
whoa,
faith
like
promoting forged
they were highly
documents?
faith promoting. So one of them was about a very miraculous experience where Joseph Smith's life was preserved in Nauvoo, from a supposed assassination attempt by William Law. And what happened is that the woman who wrote this account as the account of her journal of her great grandmother, she remembered hearing a family story when she was young. This is what I've reconstructed, at least, about this incident. And then she thought she had read an actual journal, so she attempted to reconstruct the journal entries. And on the surface, it all seemed plausible. But when I looked into it, the terminology, that there were historical errors that someone in Nauvoo would not have made. There was language that was completely out of the 20th century church. It was not 1800s church language. There was another set of documents where a descendant of Joseph's brother Samuel H. Smith had all these prophecies that Joseph Smith made in Nauvoo and so on. And it looked really legit. And then I was able to figure out that it also wasn't genuine. And so I think in connection with other things that were raising questions for me,
Felt like it was a
realizing
blow to
a
your
couple
faith.
historical sources that I had put a lot of weight on were not genuine. Um, I discovered, I figured that out about both those sets of documents within a short time. And there were other questions that were being raised right at that time for me as well. And so there was a kind of implosion of my remaining faith. And I, um, I continued I continued thinking the church was a good thing. I continued going to church for some time. I didn't think anymore that the foundational claims were like historically true because of this sort of collapse in my intellectual evidence and then not feeling like I could, in a non-arbitrary way, like rely on faith and my own spiritual experiences.
Right. So it sounds like you didn't want to be guilty of confirmation bias. So you're starting to lose trust in spiritual experiences or viewing it as, oh, well, my spiritual experiences just happen to confirm my faith or what I already believe in and comparing that to, people in other religions. And it sounds that some of the things that you saw as good intellectual evidence in favor, some blows to that, and
Yeah.
maybe some of the intellectual arguments or evidence against starting to grow. But what would you say at this time, if you were to summarize in maybe just a few points, what were some of the biggest maybe issues or doubts that you had either against Joseph Smith or church history at this time that were heavy on the unbelieving shelf?
So, yeah, one second. Um, so yes, some of the heavier issues for me, I mean, definitely there were a lot of issues surrounding Book of Mormon historicity. Um, People were starting to talk a lot about DNA stuff at that time, which I actually, I don't know, I would view differently now, but at the time I really was expecting that there would be like a lot of identifiable DNA traces of the Book of Mormon peoples. I
Were you
wasn't
still
seeing
believing in the
that.
hemispheric geography and that all Native Americans
No,
came from the
no,
Lehites? No.
no, I wasn't believing in hemispheric geography, but I still thought that, and I was open on the geography, but I largely thought it was probably Mesoamerica,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't seeing what I thought I should see. Um, I was raising questions about the Book of Mormon text, like the use of the King James text, like King James Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, and arguments that some of the King James errors showed up in Book of Mormon Isaiah, things like that. I thought, well, where I can test the text, it's modern. So why would I think that the rest of it's ancient, right?
Mm.
And so you think the Book of Abraham, the like mismatch. I was aware of the different theories, but the
Like long scroll
mismatch,
versus catalyst.
yeah. I there were things that I thought didn't line up. Um, uh, Joseph Smith's polygamy became kind of a bigger and bigger one with time for me. I had been well aware of a lot of what happened in his polygamy for a long time, but I started to become more troubled by various things that I saw, like sort of how things had played out. So those were certainly some of the bigger issues for me.
And during this time, were you keeping it very much internal that you were having these faith struggles and gradually losing faith? Like, did family or friends or church leaders were they aware, or was this just very much you lonely keeping this to yourself as you were slowly losing your faith?
I mostly kept it to myself. I did not tell my family. Particularly, I thought my parents would be really heartbroken. I had a handful of friends that I would talk with. A particular shout out would go to my friend Trevor Luke, who's just been a friend for decades. Just really processed a lot with me. Um, but It was mostly internal.
Right. And then when and why did it lead to the point where how did you get to the point where you're like, I no longer believe and I'm gonna leave the church? I think from listening to previous interviews, you lost your faith, but you continued to stay in for a few years until you finally removed your name and sort of ripped
Yeah.
the band-aid off. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, like I said, I thought that the church was a good thing. When I ended up later in the world of the sort of ex-Mormon social scene, I heard countless stories of how terrible people's growing up in the church was, just how awful it was. And I literally remember thinking like, sounds like a different church than the one I grew up in, you know? And like I know obviously people have their own experiences very much, right? But my experience was a very positive one. It was a wonderful one. It was one of very close community, something that gave deep purpose to my life. It was overwhelmingly, it was a beautiful thing for me. And so I regarded the church as a good thing. I wasn't against it. My questions were about the foundational historical claims, but I didn't at that time really question the goodness of it. I became kind of increasingly frustrated with time. I kept going to church, but I disagreed with a lot of what I heard said. There were things that I would hear said, like in Sunday school, that would be really frustrating to me. People would talk about how wicked the world was, but they didn't talk about, when they said how wicked the world was, they weren't talking about, yeah, the world is so wicked because we let a child under the age of 5 die of starvation somewhere in the world every 5 seconds, or we human beings are still killing each other en masse in warfare, or things like this. It was like, some people drink beer, or it's like, you really think this is like the greatest measure? These are the greatest measures of like human goodness or badness, and
So it wasn't
like
just maybe doctrinal or historical uh, errors or silly things people were saying, but like almost coming across maybe a little bit, I don't want to say brainwashed, but indoctrinated, or you're just feeling disillusioned with some of the comments people were making.
it was things in Latter-day Saint culture that were
Right,
frustrating. It was the culture. So I also partly felt disillusioned because I loved the vision of the restoration. I would read where Joseph Smith said something like, it is one of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism to receive truth, let it come from where it may. So
right.
wherever there's truth, he said we should gather up. He said, we should gather up every good and true principle, or we shall not come out true Mormons. So like and in so many ways, there was this broad vision, there was the vision of Zion, and so on. And so when I would go to church and I would see manifestations of Latter-day Saint culture that were really different from that, like instead of seeking truth from all sources, it'd be like, is that in the manual? Or, like Joseph Smith's asking us to be incredibly expansive. So when I saw that often we're narrow, that's
Almost a little bit
frustrating.
creedal.
It's like, well, and so um, I felt like I could handle thinking that the historical claims weren't what I thought they were, but thinking that also the aspects of the vision of it that I loved so much weren't, they didn't seem to be happening. I just became increasingly frustrated with my church experience.
Were there
And
any comments by members that maybe said comments about people who either leave the church or who lose their faith or their testimony? Any remarks about like, oh, well, they never had a testimony in the first place, or they're offended, or they stopped doing the spiritual
of
things? And did
course,
any of that?
all the time, yeah.
Yeah,
And the image, the image of the person who loses faith or leaves was core, right? It wasn't the image of like someone who's like sincere. It wasn't the image of like the lost sheep. It was the deliberate scheming apostate, and that was galling for sure. I
It's almost like they can't validate or legitimize that somebody had maybe sincere doubts or issues or things they couldn't reconcile, and maybe for them, out of integrity or honesty, they came to a different conclusion or left the church. I think that's something, because we'll probably talk about this later. Because I've had the experience of also coming back to the church and encountering some of that rhetoric from people who leave, who say some of those things like, "Yeah, you didn't really lose your faith. You secretly loved and missed the church and just wanted to go back.
yeah,
You just couldn't handle not having a worldview, or you just missed the church." But we can often do that on both sides, because it's
totally.
hard for us if somebody goes against our lived experience in a way. Like there's no way they could leave the church for valid reasons. So we often say it
There's,
has
there's
to be this or
cognitive
that.
dissonance. Yeah, there's cognitive dissonance going both ways for people when people disagree with them, right? Or when people leave their set, their community, whether that's the Latter-day Saint community or the ex-Mormon community, right? And so, yeah, so I came to see, um, I started thinking, I had by this time, I'd made a number of historical discoveries. My view of Joseph Smith was becoming increasingly sour. I had always thought that he was sincere, even when I'd stopped believing, but I started thinking he wasn't. I started thinking that certain patterns of what I was seeing in the historical data meant that his motives were self-serving.
Mm,
And so I started asking a particular question over and over in my research, explicitly and implicitly. And that question is, what was in it for him? So with anything that would come out of Joseph Smith's mouth, right? A sermon, a prophecy, a revelation, a translation, I think, okay, in the situation he was in, how would this have benefited him, right? And I've talked about this on other podcast episodes, but like the function of a question is to focus our attention on something, right? So if I ask, what did you eat for breakfast this morning? Focuses your attention one place. If I ask, what's the most recent book you read? It focuses attention another place. Any question focuses attention. That's the function of a question. So the question I was habitually asking, what was in it for him, focused me almost exclusively on the idea that Joseph had self-serving motives. It's sort of built into the question itself, right? And so, not too surprisingly, my view became more and more entrenched with time, with asking this question across years, that Joseph Smith was self-serving. He was an opportunist, a fraud. Right?
right.
And so I like this is how I was seeing things, and I had still wanted to belong to the Latter-day Saint community. It was the only genuine community I'd ever been part of. It was something that I valued, but I thought eventually I'm going to publish this stuff, and they're not going to want me in the church. This is not a contribution, right? This is like, you know, taking a sledgehammer to the foundations of a building is not a contribution to the stability of the building, right? I felt like, what do I have? I want the fact that I want to contribute doesn't mean that what I have constitutes a contribution, right? It doesn't. I also had stopped believing in God. So after I'd stopped believing in the restoration, I still had retained faith in Christ. I'd certainly retained faith in God. I started encountering more and more experiences of the problem of evil and suffering, which had bothered me for a long time. Way back on my mission, I had encountered there was a family in our ward. They had a 5-year-old son who he didn't act like a 5-year-old. He acted much younger than that. And one day his mom told us the story. And it was that when he was an infant, he was crying all the time. They didn't understand why. Nothing had stopped him. He was crying constantly. They kept taking him to the doctor. Eventually, they did a scan and they found that there was a tumor. I think it was like the size of an orange, which basically would be like the size of almost his entire brain cavity,
Wow.
right? And it was putting pressure from the inside of his head. And there was a reason why they couldn't operate for several months, because if they operated too soon, it would kill him. And so he had to go through, sorry, just this unrelenting pain, right? And this had stuck in the back of my mind for years. And I had encountered other stories of more recently at this time of horrible things that had happened to children. And I just had the hardest time reconciling that with a loving God. I didn't see it, right? And I had other experiences that made me more aware of the effects that mental illness had on people. And even, now going beyond physical suffering, right, to how mental illness could impact someone emotionally and even spiritually, you know? And I kind of, I didn't want to believe, no, that's not true. I didn't want to accept that. I wanted God to explain himself. I didn't want to accept that without some really good way of seeing this, that this was really somehow for the best. You know, I felt like the sort of the burden of proof was on that idea, that somehow this was all for the best. And so, for that reason, and just thinking maybe I didn't have enough evidence to think that there was a God, I stopped believing in God. So I became an atheist, and I thought, there's no place for an atheist in the church. Like, you can be in the church and like just like not believe or whatever, not believe in the restoration and continue active, but like an atheist, that's like they're not going to want me in the church. And so for multiple reasons, I decided like I need to remove myself from the church. And I thought someday I'm going to publish all this work that I have and they're going to kick me out anyway. And I'd had friends who'd gone through that. I was friends with some of the September 6th or excommunicated in 1993. And I thought, I don't want to go through what they went through. And I'll just remove myself from the church. And so I found letter, sort of a form letter on church online, and then I adapted it quite a bit to put in my reasons for leaving. And what I was trying to do was make it impossible for myself to ever come back, because I thought if I put in several of the most difficult problems that like I know I'll never solve, right? Was my thinking. Then if I ever were to try to go back to the church, they would want me to like explain, well, what do you think about this now? And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, of course that's, that disproves Joseph Smith. So yeah, I could never go back. I was trying to lock the door behind me. And so I sent in my letter. At first, it felt exhilarating. When I finally got the letter back saying I was no longer a member of the church, it didn't feel exhilarating. It felt painful.
Mm.
It felt like I had removed myself from the only community that was worth calling a community that I had ever been in. And I thought, well, sort of like too bad, because it's done now and not like they're going to let me back in. Right.
Yeah.
And so I started my own, what I call my sort of wandering in the wilderness. I became, like I said earlier, very involved in sort of like the ex-Mormon social world here on the Wasatch Front.
So it sounds to me like when you removed your name, it was both, you said like exhilarating, somewhat maybe liberating in a way, but more painful and depressing than what you anticipated as well.
It felt exhilarating at the first, and it felt more painful later. Yeah. But but I accepted it. I accepted, okay, I'm out of the church now. Now I kind of need to make a life for myself. I wanted connection. I wanted some kind of spirituality, like larger purpose, even though I didn't believe there was anything supernatural, right? And so I that's something that I grappled with for a good while. I found atheism. I mean, I suppose there were parts of it that I thought were empowering. On the whole, I think the idea is like everything you care about is someday going to be gone. Everything you care about is going to ultimately be destroyed. There's no permanent value anywhere in the cosmos. That's
No real
inherently
purpose.
depressing. I mean, when we talk about what it means to be depressed, right? If someone's saying, well, in the end, you lose everything or whatever, those are depressive thoughts, right? Well, in a way, atheism is inherently depressing. And
And I
I
think
experienced
particularly as
that.
Latter-day Saints, because we have this theology, we know where we came from, we know our purpose while we're here on earth, we know where we're going after we die. And then when you lose that, you still think very deeply about those questions. And then if you go agnostic or atheist, you might think a lot more deeply and feel a lot more depressed over that. Whereas,
Yeah.
I might have had friends that I grew up with who were atheist or agnostic. When I bring up sort of but like, how do you have purpose in your life? Or do you not think about what would happen like after you die and this is it? And they're just like, yeah, not bothered by it. But I think particularly people that, when we feel like we've had so much purpose and like this worldview and this theology, it can be very depressing when,
Horrible loss. Sure.
yeah.
And I'd always, like I said earlier, I'd always been focused on like meaning in life. And
Hmm.
so to hold to a personal philosophy that said, well, you personally can find certain things meaningful, but ultimately there's no meaning to anything at all. Yeah, that's depressing, right? So, but I tried to find meaning in it. I tried to live for deep purposes, right? Like family, like making the world a better place, pursuing truth, right?
And you said that you were heavily involved in the ex-Mormon community as well, going
Yeah,
to like
yeah,
ex-Mormon conferences. Like, what was
yeah.
that like? Like, I was only sort of in the ex-Mormon space for a little bit, and because I'm over here in the UK or Northern Ireland, I was pretty much, just hanging out with my siblings and maybe another guy
Oh,
that left the church. But I was on the like ex-Mormon Reddit and on the
okay,
Mormon Stories podcast community and things like that. But
sure.
was that fun? Was there good memories? What was it like being involved in that space?
Oh, sure. I mean, people in those spaces bond over their loss of faith,
Yeah.
right? They bond over like the idea that it's not all true and that like certain things that we're raised believing were wrong or silly or um our own stories of loss of faith or and it wasn't all negative like that, but like it was certainly I
To almost feel like affirming and very much reinforcing of your loss of faith and the
yeah,
decision to leave the church being
well,
the right
very,
one.
very much. And it takes, I mean, as someone who is like an ex-Mormon, right? And who is like sad when I see people lose what they have had in the restoration. I don't want to like laud being an ex-Mormon, right? But certainly it takes courage to like leave behind things that you've always believed, to leave behind sort of the moorings that you've had. And there were a great many things that I respected and do respect about the people that I have encountered in the ex-Mormon community. And I made real friends there. It wasn't really much of a community as part of what I ultimately concluded, not the way that the church is, right? The church is like a holistic community, like um you're all bonded to each other. you help each other out in various concrete ways and so on. And that's not that the ex-Mormon circles were more like friend groups, you know.
Right.
Um, so I something that I found surprising was how I differed from some ex-Mormons. I mean, stories of rapid loss of faith, like you described for yourself, were quite common and really shocking to me. Because, I mean, for me, it was a very drawn out process, you know?
How long
So
did
I
you say it was for you? About
it
10
was
or
13
12
years.
years? Yeah.
13
Wow.
years. I was 30 when I stopped believing completely, right? So, um, yeah, I talked to this one friend who she had been very devout. She's a convert. She'd gone on a mission and so on. She read Rough Stone Rolling, found out Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, and she was gone immediately. And that's all it took, for
Yeah.
her. That was surprising to me. There are certain narratives. So like in any culture, whether it's Latter-day Saint culture or the sort of culture of ex-Mormonism, you're going to have certain cultural narratives, right? So you mentioned a narrative among in Latter-day Saint culture that people who leave, well, they just wanted to sin or they were offended. And actually, Elder Uchtdorf gave a talk 10, 12 years
I remember
ago
that talk. Yes.
that come join with us that dispels a lot of those. He brings up that people often say that, and then he quickly like sort of flips that narrative and says, no, basically, like we need to take people's reasons for leaving seriously, right?
Yeah. We have a
And
lot of misconceptions and we can be very judgmental because that's something that I appreciate that you said that for a lot of people that leave the church over faith challenges, they're kind of doing it out of integrity. Like whenever I think about myself and yourself, whenever I stepped away from the church, it was out of sincere integrity. And at that time, based upon all the information and data that I'd encountered, I intellectually couldn't make it work. And I felt out of integrity, I can't stay as a active believing member if I no longer believe. And my conscience sort of led me that
Mhm,
I have to step out. And it did take courage to,
mhm,
talk to your bishop and
mhm,
announce publicly that you no longer believe. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that for people that leave, because there can be a lot of judgment or us saying that,
mhm.
oh, they really left because of this,
Sure.
they just couldn't hack it. They didn't have a strong enough testimony. They're never really in the first place. And I think we need
Right.
to try to give people the benefit of the doubt as well and be
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah. I would encourage people to read Elder Uchtdorf's talk, Come Join With Us from General Conference. Find that talk because he addresses that just very directly, right?
It's a good
And
talk.
in retrospect, there are things that I it that I that I could have seen differently and done differently at that time. I wasn't as focused on maintaining my spiritual life as I could have been. I thought that I had given God and religion every chance to be true because I had read much more widely than most people. In retrospect, I had
Looking back from where you are now, you can.
dipped my toe in and thought that I had immersed, right? And so I was way overconfident in how much I knew about God and about religion and about spirituality. And so I certainly see those things differently now and with good reason, right? But at the time, within the framework that I was looking at things, it looked things looked a certain way, and I was going with what I was seeing. Um, now the just like Latter-day Saint culture has its narratives, um, the culture of ex-Mormonism has its narratives. So one of the most common narratives is that the general authorities are insincere, that
Yes.
they know it's all a scam, that they know it's not true, but they're
I
like holding on to it and promoting it anyway.
Well, I believe that one because I was very influenced by Grant Palmer. He was one of the main critics I
Uh,
listened to, and I think he even had a chapter in his book about that. And whenever I first stepped away from the church, I I thought that as well. I sort of bought into that, and that slowly changed a few months later, even whenever I was still out of the church. From like listening to conference again, I was like, you know what? I think they're religiously sincere, but not prophets. But I thought that as well, sort of buying into that, as you said, cultural narrative
yeah.
in a way.
Well, I heard it. I heard it all the time. Like practically every person that I encountered on the ex-Mormon social scene would say stuff like this, and I always found it completely baffling. Okay, and that's partly because I'd already done a lot of history, and so I had not only read from journals like from Joseph Smith, but I had read journals and letters from general authorities across time, including up to much more recently. I never saw the slightest sign that any of them were insincere in their private correspondence with one another. Like in places where they would, if it were a scam, they would like let their hair down and talk about the scam with the other, co-conspirators. Never happened, right? It was clear they were completely sincere. And then I also thought about kind of the logic of it that, like, well, it's not like it's not like Latter-day Saint church leaders are like trained. It's not like they go to like special schooling for this. They are called, promoted, if you will, but like called to higher callings from lower callings. So like a bishop, and an ordinary member of the congregation gets called as bishop. Among the pool of bishops and former bishops, somebody gets called as a stake president. From among the various stake presidents, somebody gets called as a mission president. From that sort of pool, somebody gets called as a 70 and up to the 12, right?
Right.
And so I thought, at what point are they supposed to magically be pinged with the knowledge, oh, it's all a scam? And how come nobody ever breaks ranks from this conspiracy, right?
Mm.
Like, there's nobody who writes in their private journal, who writes a stray letter, who has a fit of conscience that gets them to like leave the church and say, "Oh, I knew it was a fraud, but I can't go on in good conscience with it." This never happens.
And
And
I know
so I
some ex-Mormons would say, "Oh, well, they don't want to give up all the benefits and the very great lifestyle they have, the fame." But when you think about it, one, they're super old. Like it's full service they're giving in their callings to the day they die, like for apostles. And if one of them were to like whistle blow and expose, man, they would be heralded in the
they'd be a
ex-Mormon
rock
community as
star,
well.
right?
Yeah, as a
Like,
whistleblower.
so the big one that I heard was money. Well, they're in it for the money. And I remember thinking, do you have any idea how much they make? Like, because we had indication of what they make, you know? And they're like paid, like if you compare like the CEOs of like, other like nonprofits or whatever, they get paid a pittance. And so when I would bring that up, they'd say, well, it's like it's the power. They want to hold on to the power over the money. So they're holding on to the power over the money, but not using the money to enrich themselves. Like I mean, this has every sign of like sincerity, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're exercising great forbearance in how they use this vast wealth that the church owns. I just wasn't. I just this was an ex-Mormon narrative. I could just that always like just baffled me.
I'm curious because your faith journey and faith crisis was different to mine. So whenever I went through my lost faith at age 21, 22, I felt like the version of church history that I had learned, my understanding of Joseph Smith, I felt that the church had hidden or whitewashed or provided a very faith promoting view of the history, not learning about, Seer Stone, the different First Vision accounts or polygamy or Book of
Mhm.
Abraham or Masonry, whatnot. Did you also feel that way when you were out of the church, very much misled in the church? Did you feel that same betrayal? Because I guess your experience was different in the fact that you encountered some of this as a teenager and it was a long burn. But did you still feel that sort of betrayal?
I don't think I. felt it so much by that point. I think I went through that in my sort of more like connected with my first faith crisis when I was
Sort of in your
younger.
late teens.
Yeah, where I felt like different things about like the Mountain Meadows Massacre or different things. I felt like um, I'd been given a narrative that wasn't like really the truth. But here again, actually, by the time I left the church, I had historical perspective on the people who had said these things, that these limited things. And I realized that to a great extent, they were saying what they believed. They were saying what they understood. And so if somebody's telling you what they think, even if what they think leaves a lot out of what actually happened, they're being honest based on their own understanding.
Right.
And
It's not
so
like intentionally trying to deceive you or
I
tell you
didn't
an
I didn't
incorrect view of
feel
the
like they
history.
were intentionally trying to deceive, no. But by
Okay.
this point at least, I had yeah.
So while you were out, did you feel fairly certain in your atheism and that the church was not what it claims to be? I also don't think I asked you, like, were you diving down sort of like new atheism sort of content and books as well? And I guess one last question. I'm sorry, I'm asking you a lot in this question. Were there any things that still sort of were like a bit of an issue with you, like in favor for the church, or certain experiences where even though you felt kind of certain, where you're like,
Yeah,
this still is playing on my mind a little bit?
sure. Yeah. So I did feel so what I felt certain about was I felt certain that the church wasn't true. I felt certain that Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet. Um, I thought that I was seeing him clearly enough to see that he was self-serving. And the thing is that I was making some new discoveries about Joseph Smith. Those new discoveries were within a particular framework of what those discoveries meant, right? I had a certain model in mind, like I said earlier, based on certain the sort of persistent question that I asked, what was in it for him? And so
It was like
looking
this
at everything,
interpretive lens you had of Joseph Smith and
right,
how you viewed
looking
these
at
sources.
everything within that through that interpretive lens, the new discoveries that I was making all seemed to reinforce that, right? Now, later, which I'll get to shortly, like I expanded the lens or used multiple lenses, and then some of the same things look very different, but within the frame that I had at the time, the new discoveries that I was making seemed to reinforce the model itself. And so I felt really certain of myself. I felt really certain Joseph Smith was not sincere. And I kind of like had the goods on Joseph Smith. And I
So at
I
this
thought,
point, you weren't really even jiving so much with Dan Vogel's pious
oh
fraud
no,
theory. You were
I
more in the
thought Dan
camp
was
of full
wrong.
on con man,
Yeah. Mhm.
scoundrel after power and sex, and that was why
Money.
you viewed him more maybe like Fawn
Yeah.
Brody or the Tanners.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I thought that. Well, actually, Sandra Tanner, I think, thinks Joseph Smith was a pious fraud. But uh, yeah, I thought that Fawn Brody. I thought Fawn Brody's work was very lacking in detail, but I thought that her general view of Joseph Smith's motives was somewhat right. Um, I felt like she had kind of an intuitive grasp of Joseph Smith at that point. That's what I thought. And so I thought there was almost no chance of myself going back to the church at that point. And I didn't think there was a God, right? And now in God, I was less certain.
Hmm.
Okay. My biggest thing really was the problem of evil and suffering, right? And I kind of didn't want to let God off the hook for that. I didn't want to um I didn't want to look at that suffering and say, well, I'm going to assume the best of whatever, if some being made this happen or allowed this to happen, I'm just going to assume the best of that and think that, somehow it's part of a really good master plan or something. Um, there was I think both an integrity and a confusion in that vantage point, right? Because I didn't want to like I was taking the morality of this situation very seriously, the suffering of children.
Right.
I also was almost like bracketing out the possibility of a solution. Um, when I look now at the universe that we live in, right? And I look at the complexity of that universe and I look at something like quantum physics, which seems to baffle the minds of even the brightest people on Earth, right? Um, I think whatever is behind all of existence has to have a perspective that's nothing like mine. It's vastly, absurdly bigger and fuller. And how much could I understand um, the total view that this being would have, right? But at the time, I felt that if I couldn't see how all these things could be consistent with divine goodness, then I just wasn't going to let God off the hook.
Mm.
Um, and so I thought there might be some kind of ultimate reality behind things, but thinking that it was entirely good and interacted with human beings on the level that the theistic faith said it did was hard for me to believe. But I did interact with the new atheism. Sam Harris's The End of Faith was sort of my new atheist drug of choice. Like I was less impressed mostly with the other new atheists, particularly Richard Dawkins. But because I don't think he knows anything about theology or much about religion at all.
Did you read
But
Christopher Hitchens' book?
I found him more interesting in some ways, but still wanting. Daniel Dennett was potentially interesting to me, but I didn't go that deep into him. Uh, Sam Harris, his book, The End of Faith, was making the case. It's extraordinarily well written, for one thing. It's very powerfully written. Um, it was making the case that in the age of weapons of mass destruction, faith is a luxury we can no longer afford. Is making the case, and this is, post 9/11 and all this, and basically is making the case that, like, if the world ever gets destroyed by weapons of mass destruction, it'll probably be by some religious nut or whatever, which certainly seemed very plausible, particularly at that time.
Right.
And so this gave a sense of purpose to me briefly in my work because I thought I was piecing together how Joseph Smith was fraudulent. And that was actually painful for me because I had thought the church was a good thing. So if I'm finding things that undermine the church,
You're
there's a
doing more
tension
damage than
there.
good.
Right, right. Well, you're right. Would my work do more damage than good? Would my life's work do more damage than good? Well, how can it be my life's work if it does more damage than good? But it seemed like it was my life's work. So was I supposed to just abandon it? And so Sam Harris's narrative gave purpose briefly to my work. I thought, we need to undermine religion. So, that's a good thing based on this meta narrative Sam Harris was giving. Within about a year after I adopted that narrative, which is around the time I formally left the church, I abandoned that narrative. I kept seeing research showing how religion was good overall for people's physical health, their mental health, social cohesion, and things like that. And I thought, okay, at first there was a dissonance in that for me because I had this desire in a way for religion to be bad now because my work seemed to undermine it. And so I thought to myself, well, look, the reason that I stopped believing is I came to the perception that the evidence was against this. Now that the evidence seems to be stacking up that this is good for people, am I going to reject that evidence? That would be absurd. And so I just started thinking, well, maybe religion is good for people, but it's not really true, or, so I had kind of complex feelings about it, and I wanted there to be, I wanted spirituality. I wanted larger purpose. And this really leads us to my return to religion. Um,
And do you think, in a way,
I,
you still seeing religion and the church as still good, or at least it has positive benefits in people's lives? Because I think if you get to the point where not only do you see the church as not true or there's no God, but if you start to see the church or religion as harmful or it does more damage, that seems like almost probably a more difficult place to come back from. Do you think that was almost like a little bit of a seed of you still being open to the goodness and the benefits people have from not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but religion in general?
that what was the seed for that?
Do you feel like that was a seed for you perhaps being open again to exploring? Whereas if you had have
Oh,
seen
sure.
religion as very net
Sure.
harmful,
Yeah.
that may have either delayed or prevented
Oh,
your
sure.
your coming back.
If I thought religion was net harmful, yeah, I don't think I would have come back.
Whereas,
Right.
and I think that there can be a lot of people that leave religion or leave the church who can also have that view as well. Not that it's not just what it claims to be, but they believe that it's harmful or it's this very powerful, greedy corporation that's deceiving people, and with the patriarchy and abuse and things that happens. And of course, you want to legitimize some people's negative experiences, but very
Mhm.
much people, whenever they leave religion, can see it in this almost completely flip-flop way of see everything that's negative and bad and harmful about it.
There's research on memory that's relevant here, the psychology of memory, and that is that retrospective memory is actually often pretty unreliable. If you ask people how happy they were in a particular period of their lives, they don't necessarily give you very accurate answers compared to if you ask them at the time how happy they were, right? Research on happiness indicates that people tend to be pretty accurate about how happy they are right now. So people can see this with like somebody who's gone through a divorce, maybe where they were actually very happy at some earlier point, together in their marriage, but afterward they look back and it was all dark and awful. And if you knew the person during the time and you saw all the signs of happiness at the time, but then in retrospect, it was all misery. Um, People
I,
do
I
that with
often think
their
about that
religious
with
beliefs.
certain relationships I had, because I remember having a discussion with one former member, and I think just one criticism I gave to him, and I think he thought it was fair, that I said I think a lot of critics or former members who leave can often see the church like how you can see a breakup if you've had a bad breakup, and then oh sorry, that was just my phone. And I thought about maybe bad breakups whenever the relationship ends. All you see is just everything awful about that person, everything terrible
They
about
see
the
it all through the
relationship.
lens of the
Yeah,
breakup itself, right?
and
So,
you can't
yeah,
acknowledge even some of the good that was there, and then often it can take years later when the emotional detachment sort of gone. You can see like, okay, there's maybe some issues in it, but you can see it in a more balanced way. And often people who can leave can just focus on all the problems and all the issues against.
yeah. So losing faith is often painful. And so I think that often people confuse the pain of losing their faith with the experience of having been in the faith before their faith felt disturbed, right?
That concludes part one of this interview. Come back for part two when we dive in deeper into Don's reconstruction. Apologies, my voice isn't good. I've got a bit of a sore throat and a cold at the minute. But make sure you come back for part two. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe, and donate if you can. Take care. Bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.